Lord, thank you for this time when we can worship you and when we can learn to. Open our hearts, open our ears, help us to listen well. Bless Jonathan as he speaks to us all. May your spirit be with him and in all that he has to say. Amen.
Thanks, Richard. If anyone wants specific prayer, particularly what Ben was talking about there, then do catch someone either at the end or even now, whenever it's starting. I could have used the higher one, but I don't know. No, I'm all right. I'm getting quite good at this. Right. Yeah, that's what we're going to do now, is look a bit more at Jesus, just as Ben was saying, actually, it's looking at God, isn't it? So we are in Hebrews 2. Barry, can I get you to come up and just read the passage for us? Barry's kindly agreed to read the passage. We're going to actually read the whole of chapter 1 now. So carrying on from last week, we're going to be looking at the second part, but Barry's just going to read for us the whole of chapter 1. There's a few of us that are meeting to talk about Hebrews once a month on a Saturday morning. And the thing that all of us have found to be really beneficial is reading through the whole of Hebrews, not as in one go, out loud, often to ourselves, just in our house. And I'd encourage you to give that a go. You know, it was written as a sort of, it was an oral presentation that was then later on written down. Actually, reading it through like that, you hear things in it that you don't often hear when we take snippets out. But that's just by way of encouragement to try that. Thanks, Barry, if you can go.
Long ago, God spoke in many different ways to our fathers, through the prophets, in visions, in dreams, and even face to face, telling them little by little about his plans. But now, in these days, he has spoken to us through his Son, to whom he has given everything, and through whom he has made the world and everything there is. God's Son shines out with God's glory, and all that God's Son is and does marks him as God. He regulates the universe by the mighty power of his command. He is the one who died to cleanse us and clear all our record of all sin, and then sat down in the highest honor beside the great God of heaven. Thus he became far greater than the angels, as proved by the fact that his name, Son of God, which was passed on to him from his Father, is far greater than the names and titles of the angels. For God never said to any angel, "You are my Son," and today I've given you the honor that goes with that name. But God said it about Jesus. Another time he said, "I am his Father and he is my Son." And still another time, when his firstborn son came to earth, God said, "And all the angels of God worship him." God speaks of his angels as messengers, swift as the wind, and the servants made of flaming fire. But of his Son he says, "Your kingdom of God will last forever and ever, and his commands will always be just and right." You love right and hate wrong. So God, even your God, has poured out more gladness upon you than anyone else. God also called him Lord when he said, "Lord, in the beginning you made the earth and the heavens by the work of your hands. They will disappear into nothingness, but you will remain forever. They will become worn out like old clothes. Someday you will fold them up and replace them, but you yourself will never change, and your years will never end." And did God ever say to an angel, as he does to his Son, "Sit here beside me in the honor until I crush all your enemies beneath your feet"? No, for the angels are only spirit messengers sent out to help and care for those who are to receive the salvation.
Sorry. What version was that, though?
Sure.
Don't worry, it's fine. It's just interesting, isn't it, when you hear different versions, different things stand out to you that you haven't heard before. Thank you very much. Thanks, Barry. So Hebrews, just a very quick recap from last week. It's a letter written to Christians who were struggling, going through sort of tough times, and in particular wondering why life was just so difficult. If God is in control, why is life so difficult? And they were tempted in that to sort of go back to the things that they were doing beforehand, things that they perhaps found safety or found comfort in. And for them, that was going back to their old Jewish traditions. And the author writes to them with this sort of answer to that. He said, well, look, life is a journey. Life's a journey, and you are going somewhere. It's not aimless. Life is a journey with a destination. But to make it to that destination, you've got to keep your eyes on Jesus. And that's the sum, really, of what this book does. And the whole rest of the book is to turn our eyes to Jesus. And so last week we looked at chapter 1 was God has spoken. So it starts with, in the past God spoke, and now God has spoken. So it's about a God that speaks. And we looked at the fact that actually when God spoke his final word, he sent his son. And so Jesus is God's final word to us. There will be nothing else after Jesus. Jesus is the complete word and reveals everything that God intends to reveal to us. So everything that can be known about God by us in this world, in this journey, is seen in Jesus, is how he starts out. But then I don't know if you noticed, halfway through the passage, it then starts just talking about angels. A bit weird, isn't it? When we met in our group, someone said, do you know, I didn't really get all that stuff about angels, to be honest. And you feel a bit like that, don't you? It's talking about Jesus and suddenly angels come up. Well, that is a bit strange. Perhaps not as strange as we think when we look at the theme of it. Not quite such a squirrel moment. We don't really talk about angels, do we, nowadays, apart from this time of year. So if I was to ask anyone on the street, what do you think about angels? I think two things would probably come up. Christmas, angels at Christmas, and then perhaps being good. You know, so polishing your halo, or he's no angel, that sort of stuff, isn't it? Those are the sort of things people think of angels nowadays, but that isn't what the guys back then would have thought of angels, and it isn't really what the Bible tells us about angels. So the Bible really, when it talks about angels, it's talking about messengers. God, messengers of God, or that's what the word means. The word angel actually just means messenger of God. So when those words came up in the Old Testament, messenger of God, it was just translated in our language as angel. So that's essentially what it means. And so you can see that actually, well, even in the Christmas story, the angel's job in the Christmas story is messengers to Mary, messengers to the shepherds. That's what they do. And so you can sort of see the guy starts his passage with God has spoken to us and moves on to the messengers, how God has spoken to us. The weight that we put on a message that's told to us is proportional to the authority, if you like, of the person that's giving it, isn't it? You know, so I smile because particularly during lockdown, I have had so many WhatsApps and phone calls for advice, you know, because of money. And it's funny, isn't it? Because not to let too many secrets out, you know, I have been known to Google the answers and then communicate the latest guidelines to someone who then thinks, okay, I'm going to believe that now. Whereas perhaps they wouldn't if they'd read it on a government website or from someone else. You know, so we do base, don't we, the amount of weight we put on something quite big. And that's where he's going on to with this. He's basically going on to say, look, angel, if this message came through angels and you listened to that, how much more should we listen to a message from the Son of God? And he goes on to explain the difference between Jesus and angels. For the Jews, angels were a much bigger thing. So in the sense that for them, they saw the whole of the old law. So the Ten Commandments was given by angels, given to them by angels. And I'd just like us to turn to, if you have a Bible, turn to Acts chapter 7. And the reason I think it's good to turn to it is I don't want just to think this is all my idea. I think it's helpful for us to look at things up in the Bible as we look at them, just to confirm I'm not really just making it all up. So this is Stephen's being stoned in Acts 7, verse 53, if anyone was there. So Stephen, at the end of his talk, just before he's stoned by Saul, or Saul's companions, he says this, he says this to all the guys who are about to stone him, all the Jews. He says, you who received the law as delivered by angels and did not keep it. That was the Jewish position, and it's the same again in Galatians. If you look at Galatians 3 and in Deuteronomy as well, talks about it. It talks about the law being given by angels, so from God, but given by angels. And I suppose that's where he's building up to in this first part here. He's building up to his first great warning to us, if you like, and it goes along the lines of God spoke in the past in many ways. So through angels, he spoke the law through angels in many ways to our fathers. He speaks today through his Son to us. And if in those days he spoke this to the angels and you held that, how much more should we be listening now, today, to what his Son tells us? And he goes on then to give us this warning that says we must therefore pay much closer attention. We'll come back to that in a bit. But really what he wants to do here is just set out how Jesus is better than the angels. Jesus is more superior to the angels. Therefore, what he says, we must pay so much more attention to. And he does it by quoting loads of Old Testament. I think we've noticed that. That's the other thing that stands out in this passage. It's the angels, and then suddenly he goes off on all these Old Testament passages. And the bit I just want to look at, because there's loads, is just only one part. So if you are open to, at Hebrews 1, it's verses 10 to 12, and it's his quote from Psalms 102 is this. He just takes a passage out of that. And we just want to look at that just very quickly, just to highlight this, the superiority of Jesus, how Jesus is over and above all other, everything else. But the first thing is just, I suppose, to look at how he uses the Bible, the author here. So I don't know if any of you have ever looked at these passages that are here, but if you look at most Bibles come with a little sort of number or whatever that tells you where they are in the Bible, and you can go back to that place that they are in the Bible and read them in their context in the Old Testament. And when you do that, you're struck by a number of things. One is that it's not God that's speaking in that sense. So the author sees the whole Bible as God speaking, but when you look back at these passages, it's not God that said these things. So in Psalm, one of the quotes in Psalms where it says, "You are my son, today I have begotten you," that was David that was speaking. Or "Let all God's angels worship him" is Moses in Deuteronomy. That isn't, as you look back, that's not God. And yet he starts by saying, and in fact, even Psalm 102, this is the author of Psalm 102 has written in, if you were to look it up, it says, "A prayer of an afflicted person who has grown weak and pours out a lament before the Lord." That's who wrote Psalm 102. And yet this author starts by saying this, "For to which of the angels did God ever say?" Did God ever say? Everything that's written, he sees in the Old, everything that was written is God's word. And I think we can seem outdated. I don't know if you think that nowadays, as Christians that really believe, not just as Christians, but Christians that really believe that the whole of the Bible is God's word. Now you can walk into a lot of churches even, but yeah. And certainly when you talk to friends, they're like, you can't seriously still believe that. And you can be made to feel outdated and sort of not with the times. And yet this is something that the church has believed for 2,000 years, and people have gone to the stake and burned for and died for and are still being martyred for today. That actually it's not outdated, that it is actually key to following Jesus is believing that the whole Bible is God's word. Every word of it is God speaking to us, not somebody else speaking. And the second thing with that is, when you look at those passages in the Old Testament, they're talking about loads of different people. So the one about I'll be a father and you'll be my son was actually about Solomon, and how Solomon was going to build David's temple, the temple that David want to build. He says, no, your son will build that, and I'll be to him the father and he'll be to me. But the author sees all of those passages as talking about Jesus. When you go back, they're not in their own context, but he sees all of them as talking about Jesus. And I think those are two things that are so key for us when we look at the whole Bible, that actually it is all God's word and it does all point to Jesus. So we're going to have a look just at verses 10 to 12. So this is from Psalm 102. So go just verse 10. It says, he also says, so God also says, in the beginning, Lord, you found the foundations of the earth. You laid the foundations of the earth, and the heavens are the work of your hands. So if we can turn to that, Genesis chapter 1, verse 1. I flipped it or whatever it is that you count it. So this is Genesis chapter 1, which is, I'm sure, very familiar to us. So it says this, it says, in the beginning. Do you want to read it out? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep, and the Spirit of God was hovering over the face of the waters. And God said, let there be light, and there was light. So this is the account of the start of everything. And it's interesting, isn't it? It starts with darkness and chaos. You've noticed that. So it says in there, the earth was without form and void, and darkness was over the face of the deep. And some verses say darkness and chaos, that's without form and void. And darkness is never a good thing in the Bible. Darkness is always a bad thing in the Bible. It's interesting, isn't it? And then what happened? God spoke. God spoke. There was nothing, there was darkness, there was chaos, and then God spoke. And it changed. And God said, let there be light. And that's everything. Everything in all creation is because God spoke. God spoke, God spoke, and it happened. God spoke, and it happened through his word. And his word, of course, is not a thing, is it? So it's those of you who've been going through John, we've all been going through John. God's word is a person, not a thing, in that sense. That when we read the beginning, in fact, can we go to the beginning of John? Everyone's got a book, they're not too fatigued from flicking through the Bible. Let's just read the beginning of John as well. So John, in the first chapter of his book, essentially sort of narrates Genesis 1 for us. So he explains Genesis 1 in his own words and describes to us exactly what Moses was saying in Genesis 1. So it says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning with God, and all things were made through him. And without him was not anything made that was made. And in him was life, and the life was the light of men. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. All things were created through him, and that light, God said, let there be light. Let there be light. Darkness. And Jesus is, and that's what John's saying here, Jesus is the light. So when you look through the Bible, you see the beginning of all things, the beginning of creation, and God says, let there be light. And what John is saying is that's the word is there, and at the beginning of creation, in darkness and chaos, Jesus came in and brought light. And then you see the beginning of Jesus' life on earth. And John says, Jesus stepped into darkness, a chaotic and dark world, and he bore light and life. And you see it all through his accounts, doesn't he? Everything that John talks about is about healing and new life and water and new birth. And it's sort of the seeds, the kernels of what one day we'll see in fullness. Jesus steps into that. And you see it in our own lives individually, don't you, as well? In the darkness and chaos of our own lives, Jesus steps in and brings light and life and hope. In all those situations, and you often see that in the Bible, you see it's the same patterns, as sort of types of ways God set things in motion. But again and again in the Bible, and once you think about it, you start seeing it everywhere. Jesus stepping in and bringing light and life in the midst of darkness and chaos. And so that's the first thing there. He says that unlike angels, he says, doesn't he, hear that? Jesus was in the beginning, before all things were created, and through him all things were created. All the heavens are the work of his hand. So he differs quite a lot there from angels who were created rather than creators. And then he goes on and he says, they will perish, talking about everything that's been created. They will perish, but you remain. They will all wear out like a garment. You'll roll them up like a robe. Like a garment, they'll be changed, but you remain the same, and your years will never end. And that gives a picture of like a worn out bit of clothing, like a coat perhaps, or something that's had its day, it's worn out, it's got holes in it, and you basically roll it up, change it for a new coat. That's the image there that this writer is giving of everything that's been created. Sorry. That everything that's been created is actually not eternal. It is a created thing. It was not once, and it will wear out, unlike Jesus, who is unchanged. I often think that about Esther's jeans, looking at those, they're more holes sometimes than they are anything else. I think she probably needs to roll those up and change them. But yeah, it's that image of something that's worn out and then one day will be changed. And the Bible talks about that. It talks about a new heaven and a new earth. That's ultimately where we're headed. A new heaven and a new earth. And unlike all of that, unlike everything else in the universe, Jesus does not change. He does not grow weary. He does not fade. Nothing is different. From the day God said, let there be light, and he created all things, to today, to eternity, Jesus has never changed and never will change. And so the comparison, I suppose, goes something like this. Angels created, Jesus uncreated, always was. Angels, part of creation, so they're going to wear out. They're not eternal beings. Jesus is an eternal, unchanging being. Angels came with a message from God, and that message was, do this, and you will live. That was the message of the Old Testament. Do this, and through it you'll have life. And then Jesus came, not with a message, but with salvation, with himself. So it wasn't do this and live, it was come to me and have life. And that's the contrast between these two. And the picture he's painting is Jesus, there's no comparison. It's not even like you can say, well, he's a bit better there, that's a bit better there. They are as far apart as anything else. In terms of messengers to us, you can't even compare them. And that sort of lays his foundation for how he starts chapter 2. And Steve's going to be talking on this, I think, in January, but really it sort of follows on from this. But basically, he comes around to that saying, this is angels and this is Jesus. This is the Jesus that we're talking about. And then he goes on to chapter 2 to sort of give us a bit of a warning or a bit of a encouragement as to why we should listen. And he says this, he says, therefore, having heard all this about all the angels and having heard this about Jesus and the words that Jesus has brought to us, therefore, we must pay most careful attention to what we've heard so that we don't drift away. For since the message spoken through angels was binding and every violation and disobedience received its just punishment, how shall we escape if we ignore so great a salvation? So he builds his argument like that. In the past, God spoke to us through our fathers, through angels. He gave the law. And when the law was broken, you all know what happened. If you broke the law as a Jew, you know what happened. If you committed adultery, you were stoned. If you essentially killed or kicked out of the community if you broke the law. Today, now, God has not spoken to us through angels with that word. He's spoken to us through his Son. So how much more do we need to listen to that word? But he goes more than that. And this is the thing. He doesn't say what you expect him to say. How shall we escape if we ignore such a great message? He doesn't say that. He says, how shall we escape if we ignore such a great salvation? And that surprised me. I wasn't expecting that word. I never did. But I was thinking, if you're in a fire and there's smoke everywhere in the building and you're running around trying to find the exit and you ignore the exit signs, okay? Or you ignore the fireman or the fire officer, puts his little jacket on and is busy telling people where to go. And if you ignore the fire officer, you think, no, I'm all right, I'm going to just feel my way out of this one. That's pretty dangerous, isn't it? You know, you might well never make it out the exit in that scenario. But what if you ignore the exit itself? So not the signposts to the exit, not people pointing you in that direction, but you actually ignore the exit. So you come to the exit, and it's clearly the exit, and you say, no, that was not for me. I'm going to carry on rummaging my way around through the smoke. That's the difference he's talking about here. In the old days, you ignored this message pointing to God, but if we ignore and if we drift from Jesus, we are drifting from the exit. We are drifting from salvation. That's quite a mad warning in many ways, isn't it? And I did touch on warnings last week, and I am fully aware I need to redress the balance in some ways. And I wanted to very quickly say, because I think we'll touch on it later in the series, that the two books of the Bible that give the starkest warnings, I think, are Jude and Hebrews. And Jude is very stark about warning us about falling away. But the two places that give the strongest assurance of our faith, the strongest message that God holds us, is Hebrews and Jude. Jude finishes with the most amazing one. To him who is able to keep you from falling and present you one day before his presence with great joy. That's how he finishes it all. And Hebrews finishes the same way. To God who is able to keep you. And I think that we have to hold those two in balance. I think we can't ignore warnings on the basis that God will save them, because they're real warnings. And yet we have to know that amongst that we have a God that has promised to hold us. And I think that's why the warnings are part of that. I think the warnings are part of the way that God in his sovereignty holds us. So we'll plan that. I think we'll touch on that a bit later on. So I think that. So how does that affect us today? I suppose. Lastly, I don't think the original hearers were probably more likely to worship angels as well, which we're not that likely to do. And as I say, angels don't really feature that much. But I think listening to other things above Jesus does all the time affect us. So, particularly in our culture, where everyone here probably in the last week has probably had a conversation that went something along the lines of, well, that's great for you, that's just not for me. It's where, in a world where we can pick and choose what we listen to, this is so vital for us. And not just in general, but even in the Christian world, if you want to say, even when you're looking at new authors, new books, new ideas, the latest thing, the latest leadership thing, the latest thing that's just grabbing the church. You've got to be doing this, you've got to be doing that. And the author here is saying, well, not any of those are wrong, but actually make sure it's founded on Jesus. Make sure it's Jesus that you're hearing. And that's the thing that I think is key for us, is that in our life situations, whatever we're going through, good, bad, whatever, that it's very easy to look for stuff that we think will help us. No, I just need to do this, I just need to do that. And I think what the author would say here was come to Jesus and see Jesus. The whole of this first chapter, we spent a long time on just that one chapter, because what he's doing is painting a picture of a God who is sovereign over everything. Jesus is sovereign over all things. No matter what you're going through, no matter what is happening in your life, coming to Jesus and seeing Jesus for who he is will transform the situation. Not a list of things you should and shouldn't do, but seeing Jesus. And I think just those passages from the Old Testament, I pray regularly that I would, in my daily job, would have that view of Jesus as sovereign over all things, creator of all things. Because I think that changes and transforms how you approach every situation and every conversation. So that's it, I think. I'm off track a bit at the end, but I think, it's kind of come back up. So, and I would encourage you, to read the rest of Hebrews is essentially the author going on to talk about Jesus, who he is, and how everything that's come before him points to him.
Thanks. So we are done for today. I gave you lots of encouragement.